Hello, class. My name is Dr. Neil Sogi, and this week we will be taking a look at memory. And I want to start off with a little joke. So, a few old couples used to get together to talk about life and to have a good time. One day, one of the men, his name is Harry, started talking about this fantastic restaurant he went to the other night with his wife. Really? One of the men said. What's it called? After thinking for a few seconds, Harry said, what are those good-smelling flowers called again? Do you mean a rose? The first man questioned. Yes, that's it, he exclaimed. Looking over at his wife, he said, Rose, what's the restaurant we went to the other night? Ha ha. On to memory. It's said that education is a lifelong process, and we're learning all the time. But simply learning without being able to repeat what we've learned in any other situation or in any other occasion is really no use. So, we must be able to make use of past experiences. We must be able to reproduce it. And this power of reproduction we call memory. It's our ability to retain and recall the past events to present consciousness. And this implies that memory is the reproduction of past experience, even without the presence of the stimulus. And there's lots of ideas about memory. Memory is the retention or storage of information in any form. Memory consists in learning what was previously learned. The power that we have to store our experience and to bring them back in the field of consciousness sometime after the experiences have occurred. Memory is the ability to retain and produce impressions once perceived. Overall, memory is that special ability of our mind to store when we learn something, to recollect and reproduce it at some other given time. Memory is the complex process involving learning, retention, recall, and recognition. The experiences which we undergo leaves traces in our minds in the form of schemas. The length of our retention depends on the strength or quality of these traces. Now, there's various different types of memory and various parts of our brain that help us encode different types of memory. Now, we're not going to go over the neurobiology of it, but I do want you to understand the types of memory. First off, we have immediate memory, also known as sensory memory or short-term sensory memory. This memory is when the individual has to produce immediately after they learn something. So the learned matter is forgotten quickly. So we may first look at the seat number of our ticket, and once we sit down, we forget about it when we go into a theater. So in this type of memory, the retention time is very brief. Immediate memory is needed, and that helps us to learn a thing immediately, with speed, with accuracy, to remember it for just a short duration, and tend to forget it rapidly after its use. Then there is temporary memory, or what others will call short-term memory. And this type of memory is not short-lived in the immediate memory sense. The information is temporarily stored in short-term memory, and that may last as long as, for example, 30 seconds, even if the material is not being rehearsed. However, some people are able to retain much more information in long-term memory by a process called chunking, which groups information by coding it. So, for example, the numbers 1, 4, 3, 2, 5, 4, 3, 7, 6 can be remembered by listing them under 3 heads. 1, 4, 3, 2, 5, 4, 3, 7, 6 is easier to remember than the series of 9 numbers that I gave you before. And then we have long-term memory. Long-term memory, also known as permanent memory, is where the individuals learn and retain the information for a very long period of time. There's an interval of time between learning and recall or reproduction. So long-term memory would be something that we would use to, for example, remember our address or our name or our phone number. So we see that memory is a process involving learning and reproduction. The amount of material that can be immediately reproduced after one repetition is called span of memory. And the whole phenomenon of memory can be really broken down and understood under 4 different aspects, what we can call the 4 R's. So they would be registration, retention, recall, and recognition. Registration is the foundation of memory. Something can't be remembered unless it has first been registered or learned. Learning needs to be very economical with time. And so there are different methods that we can use to learn or memorize something. And we'll look at some of those. One of the first ways is what we can call rote memorization. And this is learning basically without understanding. Meaningful material is much easier to be learned than nonsense material. It's easier to learn poetry than prose. Prose is easy to learn than disconnected words. Disconnected words are easier to learn than nonsense words. There's a logical sequence in all of it. And so when ideas are systematically put together or arranged, it's much easier to learn. But if we just simply practice something, we can still learn it. Then there is the technique of spaced or mass learning. In spaced learning, the learner has been allowed some rest in memorization. The subject is not required to memorize the assignment in one continuous time period. Intervals are provided. So we have breaks. Basic principle is work and rest. In mass learning, the subject has to memorize the assignment material at one sitting without any interval or rest. until it is mastered. Shorter study periods are better for young pupils and slow learners. Spaced learning benefits pupils of lower classes when motivation level is low or material is complex and difficult to understand. It is better to introduce periods of rest whilst studying. And this helps in removing the monotony of long periods of study. Attention also does not flag or fatigue, and so that's avoided. Mass learning is effective when the pupils are very intelligent or are highly motivated. Although both the methods of learning are found to be useful and effective in one situation or the other, the fact is that success in the use of a particular method, whether it be spaced versus mass learning, really depends more on the abilities of the individual and the nature and range of the material to be memorized than on the method itself. Then we can think in terms of whole versus part method of learning. So let's again take that example of a poem. When the poem is read again and again, from start to finish, this is the whole method of learning. This method can be adopted when the material is not very lengthy and when the material is logically arranged. Less time is used compared to part method. Here again, the poem, for example, is broken down in parts or stanzas, and it's learned. So slow learners and average students are benefited. The learner is motivated each time they master a part. Therefore, the whole content is slowly mastered. So again, it's going to depend upon what works for the individual. Is it a whole learning process or a part method of learning? And remember, this is under the heading of registration. So it is the way that the information is encoded and registered in the memory. And what we're talking about here are the methods for registration, the spaced versus mass learning. There's also recitation. So this also falls under that heading of registration. This is the best method of learning whereby the student reads the lesson a few times and then reviews the lesson without the book. So he basically recites the material that he learned. And studies have shown that self-recitation is better and saves time when compared to just reading and rereading, because permanent retention is achieved when you self-recite. Learners are able to detect their weaknesses through self-recitation, and they can rectify them, and so they can see their progress and they keep up the motivation. And then there are mnemonic devices. And here is where we group things together. So in a mnemonic device, artificial associations are made to the associate of ideas within the material. Therefore, memory can be used to improve through the artificial association, and this artificial association is called a mnemonic. So when I was in school, I had a locker, and my locker combination was 260130. And so in order to remember my locker combination in school, 260130, I would use the mnemonic device. Toothpicks are so dirty. And that would help me to remember 260130. So any kind of artificial associations that you have, and the more strange the artificial association, the funnier the artificial association, really the better it is for having the mnemonic device. Okay, so that's registration, the ways that we encode the information into our memory. Then there's also retention. And retention is the process of learning that involves the stage of retention. Thus, learning becomes permanent. Retention is the inactive state of a learned activity. So the learning activity leaves a mark on the brain structure. This mark is called a memory trace, which is imprinted on the cerebral cortex. This preservation of the memory trace in the brain is retaining of the learning activity. This can be compared to the traces or marks in the sand. Our footprints made in the sand, for example, when we walk on the beach. The deeper the trace, the longer the retention. The weaker the trace, the more they're going to fade away. Memory can be improved by the depth of the trace or retention. But it's difficult to improve by practice because a lot of this trace depends upon genetic inheritance. But there are some ways that we can improve retention. We can improve retention by recall, by recognition, and by relearning. I should also mention that these methods are good ways to evaluate the retention of the memory trace. So the recall method is a direct method of testing retention, where the capacity to recall and reproduce is tested. We can recall matter only if we have retained it. For example, in a writing of a test, the pupil's retention and recall is tested. But sometimes we are not able to recall, even when we know the matter. So we cannot measure the retention. Therefore, this is really the poorest retention score of all that is learned. There's also the recognition method. And this method is widely used now, a response given from which the pupil has to pick out of the correct answer or recognize the correct answer. This ability of recognizing the correct answer helps measure the power of retention. Then there's the relearning method. So let's give an example. ABC is learning a long poem, and it takes him 20 minutes and 4 trials to memorize it. After a few days, ABC again learns the poem, and now in 10 minutes and 2 trials, he learns it fully. So we can assume that retention has taken place because the time and number of trials have reduced. Therefore, this method is the best compared to recognition and recall methods. Okay. Then we have recall. The third aspect of memory is recall. We learn because we need to recall them at some point of time or another. So, we can say that recall is the mental revival of past experiences. Recall depends on the mental condition and the memory trace formed. And then we have recognition. Recall and recognition are really closely related. Recall provides the material in memory, while recognition is the process of accepting or rejecting. Recognition is better than recall as an index of retention. Recognition starts with the object given, whereas recall finds the object from the mind. Thus, when we meet a person, recognize that person's face, but may not be able to recall their name. Recognition is more a passive behavior than an active process, like recall. So that's basically memory. But there is another side to memory, and that, of course, is forgetting. In our daily life, we have experienced the time when we wanted to recall the name of a friend, and we realize that we've forgotten it. Forgetting occurs only when some learning has taken place. If there is no learning, then there is no forgetting. Thus, forgetting and remembering are two sides of the same coin. So, when we are unable to remember, it's called forgetting. Forgetting is the loss of permanent or temporary ability to recall or recognize something learned earlier. Forgetting means failure at any time to recall an experience when attempting to do so or perform an action previously done. Forgetting is the failure of an individual to review in consciousness an idea or a group of ideas without the help of the original stimulus. Thus, forgetting is being unable to find the correct information from the mind at the given situation. Forgetting is temporary at times, when later we can remember the names and actions, whereas forgetting is said to be permanent, when in no situation are we able to recall the information. So let's see why we're unable to recall information and why we do forget from time to time. There's lots of different factors that influence forgetting. Of course, there is the biological, physiological factor, but let's take a look at what we call decay. There's decay of memory through disuse, or what we call the theory of decay, and that's really forgetting. Forgetting is a process of fading what has been learned over the passage of time. According to this view, those vivid impressions created in the cerebral cortex fade away as time passes. Such fading or decay could be the result of the normal metabolic processes of the brain. As time passes, these processes might cause the traces of material once learned to disintegrate gradually and eventually to disappear altogether. Then there is interference of association, or the theory of interference. And here we see that forgetting is not caused by just fading away of traces, but by influence of the intervening activities. So basically, we're rewriting over our mind, and so we're making space by writing over stuff we learned before. And there's two different ways of thinking about interference of association, or the theory of interference. The first one is retroactive interference, and here new learning works backward and interferes with old learning. And then there's proactive interference, proactive inhibition or proactive interference. And here we have learned previously something, and that interferes with our new learning of something. Forgetting in our daily life is more due to proactive interference, and our ability to recall what we have learned is reduced by experiences we previously learned. And I'll just give you a weird example of this. Growing up, I used to work on a tractor, and I had to push the throttle on the tractor forward in order to slow down the tractor. Then I went later on to learn how to fly a plane. But to push the throttle forward in the plane means to rev up the engine of the plane. And one time I pulled the plane up to get some gas. And what did I do? I pushed the throttle forward like I used to do when I would stop a tractor. Only this revved the engine up and I almost crashed the plane on the ground. That would be an example of proactive interference. Okay. Then there is the theory of repression or motivated forgetting. And that's a type of forgetting. So the two earlier theories are really physiological processes of affecting mental trace or interference in learning. But here in the theory of repression, the person is not given importance. For some people, forgetting is a physiological process whereby will, the unpleasant or conflicting experiences are repressed or pushed into the unconscious or forgotten. Therefore, repression is done because it may cause anxiety to remember the experience. So, for example, remembering loved ones that you may never see again, or forgetting people that once hurt us would be the theory of repression. Then there are emotions. A rise in emotions like fear or anger or love lead to forget the learned experiences. So a student afraid of a teacher may forget what has been learned. There can also be a change of stimulus conditions. And we may have learned in a specific environment, but we forget in the changed environment. And we can say this. We can say that we speak well at home, but in front of an audience, for example, we forget how to speak. It may be because of poor health that prevents us from remembering learned material. Or we may have a defective mental state, so we may be exhausted or have a lack of interest, or simply not have the will to try to remember something right now. Now, there are some factors that help us to minimize our forgetting, or factors that we can say help us to improve our memory. One of those is the rate of learning. Now, it's really a fallacy that rapid learning is associated with rapid forgetting, that idea of easy come, easy go. But the reverse is actually true. In rapid learning, forgetting is slow. And when learning is slow, forgetting is rapid. Thus, a slow learner would eventually lose interest in the subject, thus forget the material rather quickly, compared to a quick learner. Then there's overlearning, and this is when forgetting is said to be taking place as soon as we stop learning. So we must recall immediately after we have learned something. And this must continue after intervals. Learning must be carried beyond the point where recall is just barely possible. Overlearning is beyond the point of complete mastery, where it strengthens the impressions in the brain. Now, finally, how can we improve the way we learn and decrease what we forget? First off, we need to have a will to learn. Learning is better achieved when there is a drive to learn. Thus, without intention, learning is not achieved. Second, use multiple sensory learning. Things are better remembered when they are presented by more than one sense. So, for example, they're heard and seen, or they're heard and written down. That always helps better retention. Thirdly, rehearsal and recitation. Rehearsal and recitation are useful in memorizing because there is the self-evaluation process, and that makes it possible for us to modify our learning accordingly. Spacing your learning. So distribute your learning, and that helps for better retention for the things you learn when you break it into small parts, and therefore it is retained longer. Next, if you want to remember something, follow the principle of association. Associating what we are learning with what we already know helps us remember something. So, for example, A for apple, B for bear, Z for zebra. All of that helps us to learn. So, again, following that idea of associations, use correlations. It's important not to put what you learn into watertight compartments. It's better to make associations with what you already know, to relate it to other subjects that you find interesting. And that way you will create better correlations and stronger connections. Also use the principle of grouping and rhythm. For example, multiplication tables and poems are easier to learn because of grouping and rhythm. Use mnemonic aids in your learning. And then vary the way that you study. Go from whole to part to whole. So before intensive study, go through the whole matter. Understand it. Then break it down into parts. And then understand it. And then study it in a whole again. And understand it. And then follow the whole to part. And part to whole. And in doing that, you will really remember something for a long time. It's also important to remember to take breaks. So, study, take a break. Study, go for a walk. Study, rest. Study, take a nap. A fresh mind stores more meaningful experiences over a long period of time than a fatigued mind. It's also remember to overlearn something. Overlearning helps with your retention. You review something, you revise something. If you go over it again and again and again, your mind knows this is important, I must keep this, and it stays in your long-term memory. So also avoid interference or subject similarity. Interference, remember, causes forgetting. So similar situations, subjects, should be spaced out. You should complete the work of one, do sufficient drill work on it, and then begin learning the next situation. And always remember that it's good to have a good learning environment, that where you can focus, where you have some aids to help yourself remember, to use varying techniques. All of this helps in you to avoid forgetting and to maximize your learning. And we will stop there for today. I hope you have a good week. Bye-bye.